This is part two, talking about why I love trains and how toy trains actually became model trains. In the first segment, we talked about toy trains and why they were so important for kids. They were all made out of metal, they were not very realistic, and they had big bulky motors, and they ran around a circle in most cases. They usually were not very elaborate. But finally, as we get towards the end of the 30s and the early parts of the 40s, there's some major events that are occurring in the world that are really going to change toy trains. World War II came in 41. We all know about the attack, for example, upon Pearl Harbor. This made a really big difference. The first Christmas of 1941, kids were still enjoying their toy trains because the stores were well stocked and there's still plenty of them in the warehouses. But a major event occurred in June 1942. The government actually put out a proclamation that said it would be illegal to produce electric trains after June 1942. Now, by the way, this did not just affect toy trains. It also affected things like autos and other household items that were available and made out of metal. Cars, for example, car dealers were told that they could not sell cars anymore. They had to put them under cover, store them away in a warehouse, and the government would then issue them out to government workers and to doctors as there happened to be a need. But a consumer simply couldn't walk into an auto dealer and buy a car in 1942. The reason, of course, was metals that needed to be made for the course of the war. There was a profound change at a train company like Lionel. Lionel and American Flyer actually both went off to war, and that meant that they were making critical war materials. Next picture. Lionel goes to sea. Lionel goes to war. On the right-hand side in the lower corner there, you see some of the things that Lionel was making. Certainly not toy trains. These were things for ships, for navigation purposes, all things that helped the war effort, all things that helped the United States in the war effort overseas. Next picture. Here is a case of war with tin, just to show you exactly why tin was so important. You were allowed to buy a tin can of food, a can of beans, for example. But when you got it home, they're showing you there in the picture on the right that you have to crush it. You wash it out first, you crush it, you can then put the lid inside the crushed can, and then you take it to a deposit area where you then can recycle the tin. That's how valuable tin was for the war effort. And because toy trains were made out of tin, naturally, they were one of the things that was restricted as such. Lionel, of course, being able to make things for the military, this was a good thing. But they also wanted to keep alive the idea of toy trains. But what could they do? They were actually forbidden from actually making any kind of metal trains. One thing they did come out with a solution, which turned out to be pretty silly, and the next picture will show you. Here it is, Lionel's paper train. This was the only thing that they could produce in the years during the war that kept people interested in trains. This turned out to be an utter disaster. First of all, it was on a piece of cardboard. You had to punch out the pieces individually, and you had tabs on each piece to put them together. You would laboriously work on this, maybe half the night, get the car put together, and then next morning find out that it had actually fallen apart. And you'll notice that they even gave you some paper track that you could actually supposedly push your train around on, but of course you couldn't. And of course there was no motor in this because motors were made out of metal. And making train motors during the war was something that was not allowed. So kids would buy this. They could buy it for about $1 or so and get utterly frustrated. Today, if you happen to find one of these things unopened, unbroken up, well, it's worth a lot of money, but it's only worth a lot of money because of a curiosity, not for any other value. One of the things that did happen during World War II was that the ʻŌlelo company, for example, did do some research on what trains would look like when they were finally able to make them again. There was a new material that came along that was going to revolutionize the way trains were made. And this new material was called plastic. The advantage of plastic was that it could be in a liquid form, it could be forced into a mold, and the mold, if the mold was realistically designed, it could produce something that better resembled a real object. Now trains were actually in the situation where they became models rather than actual trains. Next picture shows you the picture of the first post-war train. This train was produced by Lionel for the 1945 Christmas season. The European War, World War II, had ended in September 1945. So Lionel only had a few months to convert its factory from helping out the Navy to producing toys. Just a few of these trains were actually made, but there's a stark difference between this particular train and the trains that they were making in the 1930s. The engine, of course, is very realistic, and it was cast out of heavy metals. All the cars on this train are still metal, but they're made as realistically as they possibly can. There is one exception in this particular train, one exception that makes it different than all others and gives you an idea of what the future is going to be. And that exception is the gondola. The gondola is made out of plastic, and as a result, it's a very realistic copy of what a train gondola looks like. And from this time on, these trains would be something that would be exceptionally more realistic. Models that could actually be put in a museum rather than simply played for. There were other big differences that occurred at this time. Lionel stressed, for example, that trains would also be good for father-son relationships. This was a bonding experience. Fathers were encouraged to get down on the floor and help build their sons' trains and enjoy the hobby together. So gradually, recreationally, what was happening was that model trains were becoming more of a model for adults rather than just for kids. In fact, today we see some of the largest train outfits in the United States, usually made by middle-aged men, sometimes even retired men. This made it much more different. Trains were also much more affordable in this period of time, and that also made a difference. So many of the soldiers who came back from the war wanted to buy the very first train, maybe for their first child, for example, or in many cases, maybe just for themselves. Model trains became particularly popular around Christmas, and it kind of became a tradition in America to build a train underneath a Christmas tree, a circle of trains running underneath the tree. This was something that became part of Christmas. Lionel was successful in making this happen and advertised it that way. In fact, most of the new trains all seemed to come out just before Christmas, which encouraged people to buy them for the Christmas tree. Now, we have a picture of a model train, a modern model train. This is one of the most popular of the model trains that Lionel made. It's a Santa Fe. It was very popular because of its color, but you'll notice that it's also extremely realistic. This is a train that could go into a museum and could sit on a shelf. It could actually represent something that was the real thing. So this was the way trains had transformed from toys. They weren't merely toys, they were now models, models of the real thing. And this made a real difference. Now, Lionel wasn't always successful, and they weren't always geniuses when it came to trains. Once in a while, they did screw up and come up with the wrong decision. This next picture will show you of what happened with Lionel when they made a mistake. Look at this. This is Lionel's famous girls' train. Somehow Lionel wanted to broaden the business of selling trains, and they figured that there needed to be a train for girls. Well, so they came up with a train that they thought girls would like. This is the famous Lionel girls' train. Look at the colors. It turned out, of course, that the girls who did want a train wanted a train that looked like a train. What girl would want a pink locomotive and a pink tender? Lionel produced a great number of these, thinking that they would sell them very well. They ended up, of course, in hobby shops, sitting away on the shelves with nobody buying them. What could they do? The hobby shops usually, after a while, because they wanted to get rid of them, would simply paint the engines and the tenders black. This was one way to do it, to get rid of the stock. But even the cars were a distraction. Look at those colors. No American railroad has cars that are actually that color. So again, this is a very unrealistic model train, and it certainly was not a success. Now it's funny, of course these trains did not sell when they came out in 1957, but later on, because they were such a screwy idea, they became kind of popular. And today, for example, you can buy one, and if you get the actual original antique from 1957, you'll end up paying a lot of money for this particular train. And they've actually made copies of these trains. You might also find this engine someplace that's painted black. And if it flicks, the black paint flicks off, maybe underneath you'll see the pink color. And you realize that you've got something that might be kind of valuable as a result of that. Let's take a look at some of the things that you might need for a train. You know, we already talked in the first segment about the fact that a simple way to start is to have a piece of plywood 4x8. But you could also put your train on the floor. No problem about that. Now there's many different ways to control the electricity on a train. It can be done digitally, it can be done by handheld remotes, but frankly the simplest way to do it is by something called conventional control. That's where you simply hook up a transformer to the track with 2 wires. Turn the knob and you can simply run your train. Push a button, you can ring the bell. Put smoke tablets or smoke fluid in the stack, and you can have it smoke. And besides ringing the bell, you can probably also have the train sound itself. Trains have evolved now so they almost always have sound, smoke, and a bell that you can actually ring. And in many cases, you now can automatically couple the cars together, something that was never done in the old days. So toy trains have really become model trains and can do much more than what they used to do. One simple way to start is to buy something called a starter set. Frequently these are sold at Christmas time. What do these contain? Well, an engine, a couple of cars, a circle of track, and a transformer. All this is all one part of the set. The starter set usually sells for nowadays for about $120 to $180 for the set. You get it all in one box, and you can set it up underneath the Christmas tree, and you can run the train. Probably you can set it up in probably less than about 15 minutes or so. So this is one of the easiest way to start. Another way to start is to buy something that's used. You could find some very good used trains for sale on the internet. eBay is a particularly good start. If you have a particular train in mind, you can simply type it in on your Google search and the train will come up. And frequently you're going to find out that it's probably for sale. Sometimes you'll see in the caption that the train has not been tested. This might be something that's a little bit dangerous. A train that's not been tested probably has something wrong with it, or probably certainly does not run. But if the seller actually says, I tested it and it runs, I think in most cases you probably can trust him. In most cases, an old train can simply be revived by lubricating it and cleaning it up. And usually you're going to get something that will actually run. Remember, we said earlier that trains were made a little bit like fine watches. So they are precision. They are expensive, there's no doubt about it. But a lot of effort has gone into the manufacture of them. One other thing that you should consider is pay attention to curves. Don't buy a train that's too big for your curves. Almost all trains will tell you what kind of a curve they can handle. A train that's too long, for example, is probably going to derail. So that is a consideration that you should consider when you're looking for a toy train. Model trains, by the way, are an ongoing project. We often say, you are never done, you are never finished. And remember, it also hones your skills. It helps you become a better carpenter. It certainly helps you teach you about electricity. It helps you teach you about modeling. And it's something you can always work on and enjoy. It's something that becomes a lifetime pleasure. It's a good way to train a child, but it's also a good way to entertain an adult. And usually large, fairly well done model train setups with scenery, mountains, trees, backdrops, buildings, and all the things that look like a real scene. These things are important to make a train look good. I want to show you today a train that I like, one of my favorite trains, and give you a little bit of the history of it. I like interurbans. Iowa was full of them when I was a kid growing up. Interurbans are electric railroads. Usually in most cases they ran between small towns, and sometimes they ran down the streets of the main street of the town. And these railroads were all over the state of Iowa. Each summer, for example, I looked forward to going to Y Camp on an electric train, on an interurban, the Fort Dodge Des Moines and Southern. This was one of my favorite trains. Because, of course, I want to collect these trains because I like to remember them from my youth, I've had to find a place to buy them. ETS, or Electric Train System, in Prague, Czechoslovakia, still makes replicas of American interurbans. Let's see the model. Here's my ETS model train. This is what you call a steeple cab. And the nice thing about it was, for the engineer and the fireman who would ride along, this is an easy train to see from. They can see the freights as they move back and forth, and it's a good train for actually making up trains or switching in a train yard. And again, it's an electric train, so it gets its power from overhead wires. Basically what's happening is the electric comes in and actually feeds the motors, and that's what turns the wheels. This happens to be a fairly good replica of this particular train. And this train is important to me because I actually rode on it. It's a bald one that was made in the 1920s. And it used to run on the Iowa Southern Railroad. Now today it's running on the Iowa Traction Railroad up at northern Iowa. So this train still exists. It's still running on a railroad in Iowa, and it's still pulling cars and switching them around back there. So I can actually go and visit this train again, but now I have a replica of it. The next picture shows you a picture of what this train looks like in real life. There it is on the Iowa Traction Railroad, number 54. I'd like to show you a few pictures of what my train actually looks like. I'm not an expert about trains, nor have I ever built a really large outfit. Living here in Hawaii, of course, none of us ever have a lot of room. We have to build our train maybe in the attic, or we build it in the carport, or we build it in the garage. In my case, I have a third bedroom, and there I'm able to construct a small train. And I basically started out with a 4x8 piece of plywood. My train is actually a little bit larger now because I have added an extension to it. But when I started out, it was just one piece of plywood. And by the way, I should point out one other thing. I have dabbled in other scales in my time. When I was living in Guam years ago, I actually was working in HO, which I usually bought in foreign cities like Hong Kong and Tokyo as examples. But, you know, as you get older, a smaller train is something that you probably don't want to deal with. Here's the first picture here. Take a look at my train. This is the main street on my railroad. It's basically 2 circles of track, just like that track plan I had shown you once before. And in the center, there's some track that provides the possibility of a railroad yard. And by the way, there's one other thing you can do with trains. You could set them in a particular date. If you notice something in the picture, you'll notice the cars. The cars set the date of the picture. And by the way, by changing the cars, I can change the date of my train. In this particular case, I'm setting a year of about 1939 or maybe 1940. And all the cars that you see would be on the road at that particular time. And of course also the streetcars that are coming down the street. I have a backdrop which I have actually enlarged since then, but in this particular case it's a kind of a gray sky. And you notice that there's a bare tree there. What this suggests is that this is a fall scene and winter is coming on. I like to think that this is probably a representation of a November day. And although there's no snow on the ground, it's probably pretty cold. And you notice that most of the people are sitting around with jackets on, so they must be suffering a little. Next picture. This is an overall picture of the train. Basically, again, two tracks, 2 circles of track with a railroad yard in the middle. And I've also got a barn for my streetcars right here on the foreground. And again, you can see the bare trees. So again, this is a November day. A November day without any snow. This last picture, for example, shows you another type of train that I actually have. Next picture. This is my standard gauge. So in addition to having an O gauge train, I actually have an standard gauge train as well. We showed you some pictures of the standard gauge trains in part 1. And here's the ones that I own. Now once again, all of these are antiques and quite old. Almost everything on this board is over 100 years old. The buildings all made out of metal. The trains all made out of metal. And in this particular shot, you're seeing 2 trains. You're seeing a Lionel on the left, and in the foreground, you're seeing an Ives train and an Ives passenger car. The buildings in the back, though, are just representations of buildings that you can buy at Halloween or at Christmas, and I just simply painted them and added them to it. But you can also embellish it, of course, with all kinds of other things that you can add to it. I did want to show you one other thing that was made for standard gauge. There was a company called Barclay, and Barclay made lead figures that happened to be just the right size for standard gauge trains. So these figures are actually too big for this train because this train is O gauge. But for a standard gauge train, these lead figures are just about right. Now they are made out of lead, which has kind of a bad reputation. I wouldn't put them in your mouth, but of course they're painted, so I don't think you're actually going to be touching the leads quite so much. But these figures were kind of interesting to add to the train. How do you learn more and get yourself involved? You know, one thing you can make a decision about is what you want your train to be. There are plenty of how-to-do books out in the community, and these are valuable assets that you can use. There are also train magazines, and these train magazines will give you plenty of extra information on how to model your train. For example, this particular magazine, Classic Toy Trains, talks about O-scale trains. And you'll find in here dealers and how-to advice, places you can buy materials and things for the train. A second magazine is also for O-scale trains. This magazine, again, same thing, dealers and sources for materials, with plenty of how-to-do it articles that also help you along. Magazines like this can be bought in any large bookstore, so you can easily get a wealth of information. Here's a magazine that talks about other gauges. This particular train magazine talks about HO scale and N scale trains, something a little bit different from O. These, of course, are smaller trains, much more intricate, but they're actually cheaper, and you, of course, can get more railroading in a very small space. I hope today I've given you a little bit of the history of trains and how toy trains became model trains. And I hope you have been encouraged to try the experience. One thing you can do, of course, is visit the Hawaiian Railway out at Eva Mill. And by the way, remember, there's a model train museum out there. Go out and take a look at all the trains that are there and running. And by the way, for $25, you can join the Hawaiian Railway Society, and you can come out there and play with real trains. Aloha and goodbye. Okay?